Utah was isolated from major cities and the coast, and in World War II it seemed the perfect place to put prisoners of war and internment camps. And the Germans that were captured in North Africa were often brought out here to Camp Salina. And on July 8th, 1945, there was a massacre, and apparently it was at the hands of a man who was born in Nebraska that, because there were a lot of Germans in Nebraska, he had developed a hatred for German people. It was mostly a racially motivated attack, and he took his machine gun from the posts, the watchman's post, and just lit in to the German prisoners of war down on their tents as they were sleeping, and it killed quite a few of them. You can see there's basically 2 rows of graves here, and in the back you have the fresh grave of Paul Eilert, which is a pretty sad story. There he is. One of the more interesting kind of conflicts in this cemetery at Fort Douglas, Utah, behind the graves of the POW massacre victims of July 8, 1945, is the grave of Paul Eilert, who died in 1945. And like a lot of POW camps in the United States, these members of Afrika Korps would be allowed to come and go as they please. They weren't seen as war criminals or SS officers. And so when Paul Eilert died in 1944, before there were standardized headstones, his buddies got together and pooled their money from working in town and managed to get him a carving of his own gravestone. However, because he was awarded the Iron Cross, they incorporated the swastika into the German medal, which at the time was actually put on a lot of German headstones because that was just how the insignia was on their medals. It was considered a regular part of the German military. However, after they demobilized, they would often show up at parades in remembrance, for example, the regular Wehrmacht, with their swastikas removed because that was the symbol of an enemy state, although the regular soldier was not technically an enemy. However, Paul Eilert's grave has remained here, and I spoke to the gentleman at Fort Douglas, and he said that for a period of time they were talking about removing it. The compromise they reached was to put a small piece of marble over the swastika. However, somebody came by and chipped that off. So because somebody ruined that, now people are talking about just coming in and removing this headstone. And whenever this happens, they're not going to give advanced warning because they're scared of people coming and protesting. And in reality, it's not a hill I want to die on. I don't want to go to a protest for this, but it does seem a little bit disheartening to know that Paul Eilert's friends all pooled their money for him for days, if not weeks, and went out into town and asked somebody to make a custom headstone, one that is now being torn down. Relatively little is known of Paul Eilert's life, but he was one of the early men to be buried here. And at the time, there were no standard military gravestones for German soldiers. So the people at the camp, they liked him quite a bit. And they got a grave erected with a swastika on it. Well, they did this by working themselves, raising their own money, and then erecting the monument. Well, a lot of people got very angry at that, naturally, and they tried covering it up, but from time to time people would come by and chip off the marble piece that was covering the swastika, and eventually it drew enough ire to be knocked down. And I had the privilege of seeing the original gravestone a few times before it was taken out, and there was no news when it was taken out. It just happened overnight. And apart from the Camp Salina massacre, you have other prisoners of war who died from illness around the 1940s. These are all Italians who've been given their own section immediately to the right of the German section. And if I remember right, there might also be a grave of a couple of Japanese internment camp deaths from illness.